The airport terminal hummed with the usual symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the distant crackle of flight announcements. Travelers moved about, lost in their own little worlds, some scrolling through their phones, others sipping overpriced coffee, their eyes weary from long-haul flights. In one corner, near the entrance of a small cafe tucked beside the boarding gates, a man sat quietly on a worn duffel bag. His clothes were ragged, his face lined with exhaustion. A tattered backpack lay beside him, and in his lap rested a small, scruffy dog, its fur matted but its eyes bright with loyalty. Every now and then, the man scratched behind the dog's ears, his fingers moving gently, as if this simple touch was the only warmth he had left in the world. Few people noticed them. Even fewer cared. But Leonardo DiCaprio did. He stood at a distance, leaning casually against the polished steel railing of the lounge. Dressed in simple jeans and a black hoodie, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face, he blended in easily with the crowd. His name might have been legendary, but here, in the middle of a bustling airport, he was just another traveler. And yet, his sharp eyes were locked onto the scene unfolding just a few feet away. A man in a tailored navy blue suit strutted through the terminal, a rolling carry-on trailing behind him. His cologne was strong, his leather shoes pristine, and the self-assured smirk on his face suggested he was used to getting his way. As he walked past the homeless man and his dog, he abruptly stopped, as if something offensive had just entered his perfect world. He wrinkled his nose. "Ugh, disgusting," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. The homeless man tensed but said nothing, lowering his gaze. The businessman turned to the dog, his face twisting in irritation. "You're letting that flea-ridden mutt sit in an airport? Seriously? This isn't some street corner," he scoffed. The homeless man swallowed hard. "He's not hurting anyone, sir," he said softly. The businessman rolled his eyes. "No, but he's stinking up the place." And then, without warning, he lifted his polished shoe and kicked the dog. A startled yelp echoed through the terminal. The dog recoiled, trembling, its small frame curling defensively into its owner's lap. A gasp rippled through the nearby travelers. Some turned their heads, but did nothing. Others pretended not to see. Leonardo's jaw clenched. His fingers curled into fists. But before anyone could react, the businessman scoffed again and muttered, "Filthy animals don't belong here." The tension in the air thickened. The homeless man cradled his dog protectively, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't hurt him." And that was the moment when Leonardo DiCaprio stepped forward. Leonardo moved with purpose, each step deliberate, his expression unreadable. The hum of the airport seemed to dim around him, but the businessman was still too caught up in his own arrogance to notice the shift in the air. He adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit, exhaling in irritation, as if the mere presence of the homeless man and his dog had somehow inconvenienced his day. He didn't look down at the trembling animal, didn't acknowledge the way it cowered in fear, nor did he care about the way its owner's hands shook as he gently ran them over the dog's back, whispering soft reassurances. To him, they were invisible, a stain in an otherwise pristine environment that he had deemed beneath him. Leonardo stopped just a few feet away, his voice calm but firm. "That was unnecessary." The businessman finally turned, his brows raising as he took in the man standing before him. There was no immediate recognition, just the vague assessment of someone who instinctively measured people by their appearance. Leonardo's outfit was unassuming. No designer labels, no flashy accessories, nothing that screamed status. Just jeans, a hoodie, and a cap. Ordinary. Dismissible. "Excuse me." The businessman let out a dry chuckle, clearly unimpressed. "You heard me." Leonardo's tone didn't change, his eyes unwavering. There was no reason to do that. The businessman let out a sigh, shaking his head as if this conversation was a waste of his time. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't have to explain myself to some random guy in an airport." He gestured toward the homeless man, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't a shelter. People like him and his mutt don't belong here. I just gave him a reality check." The homeless man kept his head down, his shoulders curled inward, as if bracing for more humiliation. The dog, though still trembling, let out the faintest of growls, its small body pressed protectively against its owner's chest. Leonardo's gaze didn't waver, didn't flicker with anger or outrage. Instead, there was something far more unsettling in his eyes, something cold and calculated. "Tell me something," Leonardo said, his voice still even. "Did kicking that dog make you feel better?" The businessman scoffed. "What? You heard me." The businessman rolled his eyes, adjusting his jacket with an impatient tug. "I don't need a lecture from some nobody. I don't care about some stray or the guy who feeds it scraps. This isn't my problem. It is now." Something in Leonardo's voice made the businessman hesitate. He was used to people backing down, used to having the final word, used to being the most important person in the room. But the man standing in front of him didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't react the way people usually did when faced with money and power. There was no anger, no frustration, no raised voice. Just an unsettling certainty, as if Leonardo already knew how this would end. The businessman's expression darkened. "You don't know me, and you have no idea what kind of day I've had. So why don't you do yourself a favor and walk away before you regret getting involved in something that has nothing to do with you?" Leonardo tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You want me to believe this is about your bad day?" The businessman scoffed. "I don't need you to believe anything. Just move along and mind your own business." Leonardo finally glanced down at the dog, still curled into its owner's lap, its breathing uneven, its trust in the world fractured by a single cruel moment. Then his gaze shifted to the homeless man, whose grip on his companion was desperate, as if afraid that at any moment, someone else would come along and take away the only thing he had left. There was something raw in the way he held the dog, something unspoken but painfully clear. He had learned a long time ago that the world didn't come to his defense. Leonardo looked back at the businessman. "I could walk away," he said, his voice quiet. "Or we could talk about what this is really about." The businessman let out a sharp laugh, his confidence returning. "You want to talk about me? You think you know anything about me? I know enough." The businessman smirked, but there was something forced about it now. "Oh, this is rich. Some guy in a hoodie is going to teach me about myself. Go ahead, let's hear it." Leonardo took a slow step forward, closing the space between them just enough that his presence became unavoidable. "You've got money," he said plainly. "Power. Influence. You walk into a room and people respect you, or at least pretend to. You're used to getting what you want, and when someone or something doesn't fit into your version of how things should be, you step on it." His eyes didn't waver. But that wasn't about a dog. That wasn't about a homeless man sitting in an airport. That was about you. The businessman's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments. "You don't know what you're talking about." Leonardo's voice didn't rise, didn't shift, but something in it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You didn't kick that dog because you were disgusted by it. You kicked it because, for a second, it reminded you of something you don't want to think about." He paused. "And that scared you." The businessman's expression hardened. "You don't know anything about me." Leonardo nodded slightly, as if considering the statement. Then he glanced around. By now, more people had taken notice. A few murmured quietly. Others watched in silence, waiting. "Maybe I don't," Leonardo admitted. "But they do." The businessman turned slightly, and for the first time, truly took in the eyes that were now locked on him. He had spent his life commanding attention, but this was different. This wasn't admiration or respect. It wasn't fear. It was something far worse. It was judgment. For the first time, he realized that no one was looking at Leonardo. No one was looking at the homeless man. No one was looking at the dog. They were looking at him, and none of them liked what they saw. Leonardo let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then, without breaking eye contact, he said one final thing. "So, what are you going to do now?" The businessman swallowed hard. His hand curled into a fist, then loosened. His jaw clenched. And in that moment, as the pressure of the crowd bore down on him, as the weight of his own actions became undeniable, something in his posture finally cracked. But the moment wasn't over yet, because what happened next would change everything. The businessman's fingers twitched at his sides as he glanced around at the growing number of people who had stopped to watch. He was no longer just a man in a suit, walking through the airport without a second glance. He was the center of attention, and not in the way he was used to. There was no admiration in the stares, no deference, no quiet whispers of respect. The expressions around him were sharp with quiet disapproval, a slow-building wave of judgment that he had no control over. He looked at Leonardo again, his jaw tightening, his pride refusing to let him back down in front of a man he had dismissed only moments ago. His voice was lower now, but the frustration in it was unmistakable. "You think you're better than me?" The words came through gritted teeth, the simmering anger barely restrained. "Because you got a few people to look at me like I'm some kind of villain?" He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't owe you anything. I don't owe him anything." He pointed toward the homeless man without sparing him a glance. "This is my fault." "No, he's the one sitting here begging for sympathy. Maybe if he got up and did something with his life, he wouldn't be in this position." The homeless man flinched at the words, his fingers curling instinctively around the dog, as if shielding it from something unseen. His shoulders hunched inward, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't fight back, because he had long since learned that people like the businessman never listened. The airport was just another place where he wasn't welcome, another space where his existence was an inconvenience, another moment where he was reminded of just how little the world thought of him. Leonardo's expression didn't shift. His voice remained calm, steady, measured. "So that's how you justify it? You hurt someone weaker than you because it makes you feel like you've earned what you have." He stepped closer, his tone sharpening just enough to cut through the businessman's fragile sense of control. "You think his life is easy? You think sitting on the floor of an airport, hoping someone spares him a glance, is a choice he wanted to make?" The businessman let out a short, bitter laugh, his posture stiff, his frustration spilling over. "You act like I'm the bad guy for telling the truth. People like him, they want handouts. They expect the rest of us to feel bad for them. But we worked for what we have. We didn't sit around waiting for the world to take care of us." He gestured vaguely at Leonardo, his voice laced with irritation. "Maybe you get to play the hero today because you've got nothing better to do, but don't pretend like you actually care. You're just putting on a show for these people, and when you walk away, he'll still be sitting right there, still waiting for someone else to save him." The tension in the air thickened. A few murmurs spread through the crowd, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others shifting uncomfortably at the words being thrown around so carelessly. Leonardo didn't look away, didn't let the moment slip into an argument that would go nowhere. Instead, he took a breath, slow and deliberate, before speaking again. "Do you really believe that?" His voice was quiet now, but the weight in it was impossible to ignore. That no one's ever had to fight for something they couldn't win alone? That people don't fall, don't get pushed down so hard they can't get back up without someone reaching out a hand? He let the question hang between them. Let the businessman feel the full weight of it before adding. "Or is it just easier to pretend you've never needed help?" The businessman's lips parted slightly, his body going rigid, but no words came out. He wasn't expecting that. He wasn't expecting someone to strip away the argument, to push him into the one place he didn't want to go, his own reflection. His hands clenched into fists, his breathing heavier now. But something had shifted in his face, something almost imperceptible. Leonardo's voice remained even. "You're right about one thing. When I leave, he'll still be here. But that doesn't mean he's nothing. That doesn't mean he deserves to be treated like he doesn't exist. And it sure as hell doesn't give you the right to take out whatever's going on inside you on someone who can't fight back." He nodded toward the homeless man. "You don't have to care. You don't have to stop. But if you think people aren't watching, if you think the things you do to others don't matter, look around." The businessman's eyes darted to the faces in the crowd, the silent judgment pressing in from all directions. He could feel it now, the slow realization that this moment wouldn't be forgotten, that the people watching had already made up their minds about the kind of person he was. The weight of it was suffocating, heavier than anything he had expected when he had stopped in front of the homeless man in the first place. His confidence wavered, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. And then, as if grasping for control, he turned back to Leonardo, his voice sharp, defensive, desperate. "And what about you?" He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think standing here, lecturing me, makes you any different? You get to walk away after this, go back to your life like none of this ever happened. So what are you really trying to prove?" Leonardo didn't hesitate. "That you have a choice." His voice was steady, unwavering. "Right now, in this moment, you get to decide what kind of person you really are. Not the guy in the expensive suit, not the guy who thinks he's better than the rest of the world. Just you. And the only person who can answer that is standing right in front of me." The words hit harder than they should have, cutting through whatever wall the businessman had built around himself. His breath caught slightly, his mind racing to push back, to hold on to the anger, but something inside him was unraveling, something he couldn't quite stop. His fingers twitched at his sides, his gaze shifting between Leonardo and the homeless man, as if caught between two versions of himself, the one he wanted to be and the one he had just shown the world. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his voice quieter now. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't know how to. The weight of the moment was pressing down too hard, and for the first time, he wasn't sure how to escape it. The homeless man shifted slightly, his voice hesitant, barely above a whisper. Just leave us alone. The businessman's gaze flickered to him, his jaw tightening, his entire body tense. But for the first time since the confrontation began, he didn't have a response. He didn't have another excuse, another way to turn the moment in his favor. He could only stand there, silent, as the pressure around him grew heavier. And then, without another word, he took a step back. The crowd watched, waiting, holding its breath for what would happen next. Because in that moment, the decision was his alone to make. The businessman took another step back, his body rigid, his hands tightening into fists before unclenching again, fingers twitching as if his mind was fighting against itself. His breathing was uneven, his lips slightly parted, but he said nothing. The weight of the moment pressed down on him harder than he had anticipated, and no matter how much he tried to convince himself that he had done nothing wrong, that these people didn't matter, that the world worked the way it did for a reason, something inside him was cracking. His gaze flickered to Leonardo again, searching for something, some kind of opening, some way to twist the moment back into something he could control, but there was no escape. The crowd was still there, their judgmental stares piercing through him, their silence more damning than words ever could be. His usual arrogance, the shield he carried with him in every boardroom, every negotiation, every social gathering where power was currency, was no longer enough. He was standing in front of them, exposed, without status, without an audience that admired him, without a single person who saw him as anything more than what he had just shown himself to be. Leonardo didn't move, didn't press him further, didn't need to. The businessman could already feel the answer clawing at the back of his mind, forcing its way to the surface. The anger, the frustration, the bitterness that had built up inside him over the years had no outlet here. There was no one left to impress, no deal to be won, no moment where he could twist the narrative in his favor. There was only the weight of his own actions, the undeniable truth that the way he had treated a man and his dog, a moment he had dismissed as insignificant, had become something else entirely. He had spent his life in control, but this was slipping away from him, and the more he tried to grasp onto what little power he had left in the situation, the more he realized there was nothing to hold on to. His eyes landed on the dog again, still curled in its owner's lap, still trembling slightly from the impact of the kick. There was no aggression in its posture, no anger, no desire to fight back. It wasn't a threat. It never had been. It was just an animal, one that had done nothing but exist in a place where the businessman had decided it didn't belong. The homeless man hadn't moved either, his fingers still gently stroking the dog's fur, his expression unreadable but his body tense, as if waiting for something worse to come. The businessman knew that look. He had seen it before, not on the faces of the people he surrounded himself with, but on the ones he had ignored, the ones he had stepped past without thinking, the ones he had dismissed as irrelevant. It was the look of someone who had long since stopped expecting kindness from the world. The businessman exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head, his voice tight, with barely concealed frustration. "This is ridiculous." His words came out harsher than he had intended, but they weren't directed at anyone in particular, just the situation itself, the way it had spiraled into something he no longer controlled. He looked at Leonardo again, his expression tense, his jaw clenched. "You don't know anything about me. You stand here acting like you have the moral high ground, like you're any better, but what do you actually know? You think this moment matters? You think anything changes because you got a few strangers to stare at me for 5 minutes?" His voice was low, but there was something hollow in it now, something that betrayed the anger he was trying to hold on to. Leonardo didn't react. He didn't argue. He simply let the businessman's words hang in the air, let them settle, let the man in front of him sit with the weight of them for just a little longer. The businessman let out another frustrated breath, his fingers raking through his hair before dropping to his sides, his entire body tight, with something that wasn't quite rage, but wasn't quite regret either. He turned toward the homeless man again, his gaze flickering between him and the dog, something unreadable in his expression now. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer an excuse. He just stood there, silent, as if the words were forming in his head but couldn't quite make their way out. The homeless man shifted slightly, his fingers still gently stroking the dog's fur. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet. "You can just walk away." There was no challenge in his words, no anger, no demand for justice. It wasn't a plea either. It was just a statement, plain and simple, an acknowledgement of how the world worked, of how this moment would likely end. People like the businessman always walked away, always carried on with their lives as if nothing had happened, always left moments like this behind without a second thought. The homeless man wasn't expecting anything else. The businessman swallowed, something flickering in his expression again, something he clearly didn't want to face. His hand twitched slightly at his side, fingers curling in on themselves before he exhaled sharply and turned away, his movements stiff and tense. Without another word, he took a step back, then another, his posture rigid as he forced himself to move away from the situation, to retreat before it could press down on him any further. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't meet their gazes, didn't acknowledge the fact that they were still there, still watching. He just walked, his strides purposeful, his focus locked straight ahead. Leonardo watched him go, his expression unreadable, his posture still relaxed, still calm. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile in victory. He had never wanted to win. He had only wanted the businessman to see himself clearly, to understand the weight of what he had done, to be forced to acknowledge, even if only for a second, that the way he moved through the world had consequences. Whether the businessman would carry that moment with him, whether it would change anything, was no longer something Leonardo had control over. That decision belonged to the businessman alone. The crowd began to shift, murmurs spreading as people started to move again, the energy slowly dispersing, the weight of the moment still lingering but no longer holding everyone in place. Some people glanced at Leonardo with quiet acknowledgement, others at the homeless man, but no one said anything. They didn't need to. The moment had spoken for itself. The homeless man didn't move for a long time, his fingers still curled around the dog, his breathing still shallow, his shoulders still tense. When he finally looked up at Leonardo, there was something cautious in his gaze, something that wasn't quite gratitude but wasn't quite indifference either. Leonardo met his gaze, his voice quiet. "Are you okay?" The homeless man hesitated, his fingers running through the dog's for one more time before he gave the smallest nod. "Yeah." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried enough weight to say what needed to be said. Leonardo exhaled slightly, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. He crouched down, holding it out, his tone even. "There's a place a few blocks from here. They can help." The homeless man hesitated before taking it, his fingers careful, as if expecting it to be something else, something that wouldn't mean anything. But when he opened it, his expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flashing through his eyes. He said nothing, just tucked the paper carefully into his pocket before looking down at the dog again, his fingers scratching behind its ears in the same gentle way he always had. Leonardo didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The moment wasn't over yet, because something else was about to happen. Leonardo remained crouched for a few more seconds, watching the way the homeless man carefully tucked the paper into his pocket, his fingers slow and deliberate, as if he was afraid it might disappear if he moved too quickly. His other hand remained on the dog, his grip steady, protective, unwilling to let go of the only thing in the world that hadn't abandoned him. The moment stretched in silence, the energy in the terminal shifting, no longer filled with tension, but still carrying the weight of everything that had just happened. People had started to move again, shifting their focus back to their own lives. But some still stole glances, still whispered among themselves, still carried the imprint of what they had witnessed. The businessman had disappeared into the crowd, his footsteps lost in the movement of travelers hurrying to catch flights, attendants calling out final boarding notices, voices echoing against the polished floors. He had left without another word, without a final look, without acknowledging what had just unfolded. Maybe that was the only choice he could make in that moment, to walk away before he had to confront himself any further. Maybe he would forget this in a few hours, brush it off as nothing more than an inconvenience, push it to the back of his mind, and pretend it had never happened. Or maybe it would stay with him, creeping into his thoughts when he least expected it, forcing him to remember the way people had looked at him, the way Leonardo's voice had stripped away his excuses, the way the homeless man had held onto his dog, as if he was the only thing keeping him alive. That was no longer something Leonardo had control over. The homeless man finally exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly as he glanced up at Leonardo, his voice quiet, hesitant. "Why did you do that?" Leonardo didn't answer right away, letting the question settle, letting the man in front of him see that there was no easy response. He wasn't there to be a savior, wasn't there to fix something that had been broken long before he had arrived, wasn't there to make a speech about kindness or morality. He had simply done what needed to be done. Finally, he spoke, his voice even, steady. "Because I was watching." The homeless man studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. People didn't usually step in. They walked past, they averted their eyes, they pretended not to see. That was how the world worked. But Leonardo hadn't walked past. He had stopped, had spoken, had forced the moment to shift into something the businessman couldn't control. And now, he was still here, still watching, still waiting to see if the man in front of him would take the next step. The dog finally moved, shifting slightly in the homeless man's lap, its head tilting up to study Leonardo with cautious curiosity. It no longer trembled, no longer flinched at the presence of another human being. That was the only answer Leonardo needed. The homeless man hesitated before glancing down at the paper in his pocket again, his fingers pressing against it lightly, as if to remind himself that it was real. His voice was still quiet when he spoke. "Do you think they'll actually help?" Leonardo's answer was simple. "Yes." The homeless man exhaled again, slower this time, his fingers tightening briefly around the fabric of his pants before loosening. He had spent so long expecting nothing from people, expecting them to ignore him, expecting them to treat him like he didn't exist. He had learned not to trust the rare moments when someone offered something that wasn't indifference, had learned to brace himself for the inevitable disappointment that came after. But this felt different. Not because Leonardo was famous, not because he had stepped in, but because he hadn't made this about himself. He hadn't tried to make a grand statement. He had simply done something and left the rest up to the person in front of him. That was what made it real. The dog stretched slightly, then leaned against the homeless man's chest again, its small body warm, solid, unshaken despite everything that had happened. That was all the man needed to make his decision. He shifted, moving carefully, tucking his bag over his shoulder, adjusting the way he held the dog so it rested comfortably in his arms. He stood slowly, his body stiff from having sat in the same position for too long, his movements cautious, uncertain. He didn't look at the people still watching, didn't acknowledge the ones who had only paid attention because of the confrontation, the ones who would forget him as soon as they walked away. He only looked at Leonardo. The hesitation in his expression wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was the simple realization that this was the first time in a long time that someone had given him a choice. Leonardo didn't tell him what to do. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded, just stood there, just let the man in front of him decide for himself. The homeless man glanced down at the paper one more time, his fingers brushing against the folded edges before he finally nodded back. He didn't say thank you, didn't try to find the right words, didn't try to explain anything. He just turned, moving toward the exit, stepping into the world beyond the terminal, beyond the place where he had sat unnoticed for too long. The dog didn't look back. Neither did Leonardo. He didn't need to. The moment was already over. And yet, it wasn't. Because somewhere in the airport, a businessman was still walking, still moving, still trying to convince himself that none of this had mattered. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had been seen. And no matter how far he walked, no matter how much distance he put between himself and what had just happened, that truth would follow him. Because the weight of it was something he could never outrun. And whether he liked it or not, something inside him had already started to change.